Hello beautiful people. In this video I'll give you a little guide to flaps. Most planes in War Thunder have them, and they're fairly important to you and your plane's performance. I'll go over the difference between them and talk about War Thunder and the uses of flap in the game in general. I hope you enjoy and get something positive out of this video. I did not come up with the idea for this video by myself. I've begun to put a pinned comment on all my videos asking if anybody has any idea about a vehicle or a topic to make a video about. A subscriber, Rahul Samant, wrote, "Hey, I have a request. Can you make a small tutorial on flaps? I basically suck at stall fighting, how to use flaps and which flaps to use in stall fighting. Thanks." Well, I'm not sure about making a video specifically on stall fighting because I'm pretty sure I suck at that as well. But I can definitely make a video about uses of flaps in general, and it was a great idea. Let's start with some basics, how the wing works and how lift is produced. And I am using this depressed looking Hurricane because this poor thing has a fat wing and it's just easier to see this way. And let's all be nice and not fat wing shame him. Airflow hits the front of the wing and separates. The airflow continues along the underside of the wing and on the top of the wing. There is lower pressure on top of the wing because the air molecules are more distant from each other than the air molecules on the underside of the wing. And the air travels faster on top of the wing. And there's higher air pressure on the underside of the wing because the air molecules are closer to each other. The difference in air pressure creates a suction effect on top of the wing that creates lift. But that's not the whole explanation. There's another effect that comes into play, and that is called the Coanda effect. And the Coanda effect is about the tendency of fluids to stick to a surface. You can easily try that yourself by sticking a glass or a spoon under running water and see how the water sticks to the surface. But instead of fluids, we are talking about airflow over the wings, but it pretty much behaves in the same way. And that's also why the clever Borgs use cubes, because there's no air in space, it's vacuum, so you don't need wings to produce any lift. So when the airflow leaves the trailing edge of the wing, it's pointed slightly downwards because it follows the curves and angle of the wing. And when the air that follows the lower side of the wing means the airflow from the upper side of the wing is kind of forced downwards in the same direction. And that also creates lift. So what does flaps do? Let's deploy the flaps. Flaps have a similar shape to the main wing, so they are almost like mini wings. So when you drop the flaps, you increase the surface area of the wing and thereby increase lift. But using the flaps has more than just one effect. But firstly and foremost, they increase lift. And the larger the flaps are, the more drag behind the wing is introduced and therefore slowing down the aircraft. Now drag behind the flaps is like this area of swirly air that slows down the aircraft. That is also why the landing flap setting is deploying all the flap surface, making it slow down as much as possible for landing, while still producing the most lift to keep the plane flying. Let's start out with the landing and takeoff flaps. Takeoff flaps helps a plane get into the air faster because of increased lift at lower speeds, making the takeoff length shorter than without using flaps. And as mentioned for landing, it increases lift and drag, which means it slows down the plane while still keeping it flying at lower speeds. It also means that you can land with flaps at much higher angle than you would without using flaps, making the distance you need in order to bring down the plane shorter and also making it faster to land using flaps. The combat flaps are the first setting and it uses the least surface area of the flaps. So the combat flap setting will help you turn tighter by increasing the surface area, while at the same time producing the least amount of drag behind the wing. You will lose speed and energy by using any flap setting, but again using the combat flaps to turn tighter will bring along the least amount of loss in form of speed and thereby energy. Some planes also have leading edge slats placed on the front of the wing extending forward. Some planes in War Thunder also have those, like some BF-109s and some Japanese planes amongst others. You don't control them manually, they are spring loaded. Air pressure determines if they're being extended or not, so in a turn they would extend because of lower air pressure and retract when you gain speed and fly straight. There's a lot of different flap designs, but the most common are plain flaps, split flaps, slotted flaps, and Fowler flaps. When we're talking about War Thunder and the Second World War, we mostly see split flaps, plain flaps, and there are some few examples of Fowler flaps. Different nations and different companies of course experimented with a lot of different types of flaps and designs. For instance, the Ju-87 Stuka used something called Junker flaps. The Junker flap is a slotted plain flap where the flap is fixed below the trailing edge of the wing. So this means that airflow can pass between the wing and the flap even when the flap is retracted. And because the airflow is increased, lift is also increased, even at slower speeds. So the good thing about the Junker flap is that it creates more lift than plain or split flaps, and it's very simple. But because the flap is fixed and you cannot retract it into the wing, it creates drag, and that drag is permanent. But of course, not nearly all aircraft in War Thunder have flaps at all. Hardly any of the biplanes in the game are equipped with flaps, just like this Italian CR-32. And what I'm doing with these maneuvers is try to get rid of any excessive speed before I try to land. So the only way you can get rid of the speed is pretty much to apply the brakes very carefully, since if you do too much, especially in these biplanes where most of the weight is up front, you'll just end up overturned or doing a salto. And even at very low speeds in these biplanes, there's a big chance that you can just end on your back. I tried to do this little experiment with this Japanese J1N1. Now the one on the left is landing with no flaps, and the one on the right with full landing flaps. And they're both idle on engine, and they were both flying around 340 kilometers an hour when I started the descent, or started the clip anyhow. Now I was able to slow down a lot faster with the landing flaps out, and I was also able to deploy the landing gear much faster. When I finally deployed the landing gear on the plane that did not use any flaps, it took me a while to settle down or to actually touch the ground, because I wanted to bleed off as much speed as I could before actually landing, in order to make the run down the runway as short as possible. I applied the same amount of braking power to both planes, so that was basically the same. So by the time the plane with no flaps had landed and came to a stop, I was pretty much down the runway, and I just got airborne with the one where I had landing flaps deployed. Now the most important thing in War Thunder to know about when we're talking about flaps is what the speed limit is, since if you pass that speed, the flaps will break off and damage your plane, and more importantly, worsen your plane's flight envelope. Or in other words, if your plane was crap before, it's even crappier now. Now in general, and I do mean in general because there will always be exceptions for this, Flaps are stronger on fighters and dive bombers, while regular bomber aircraft have the weakest flaps. When using the word strong and weak, I'm referring to at which speed the flaps will break off. So finding the info is easy. You go to the plane, hit information, and scroll down to the flight performance section. And there it is. I don't know about you, but I definitely try out a lot of different aircraft. But what I always do first is go to the plane's information page. And amongst other things, look for the different flap settings speed limit, because that could potentially save your day, get yourself a kill, and avoid getting killed. It's always a good idea to look at your controls for using the flaps. Now normally you can actually just use one single key for it, and the game will pretty much determine if it's going to apply combat flaps, landing flaps, or takeoff flaps. But it's a good idea to actually assign two keys for the flaps up movement and the flaps down movement. That way you have full control over the flap settings. Because let's say you are in a low speed turn with an enemy fighter, and you want to turn into him or you want to outturn him, then you can easily go past the combat flaps and choose whether you want to apply the takeoff flaps or landing flap instead, which are much more pronounced and much more effective. Let's try to spend a couple of minutes and really look at a bunch of planes sitting around 4.3 to appreciate how different flaps can be and what their characteristics are. Starting out the Americans and the P-38 series. Now they have very strong flaps, and they're some of the only planes in the game that use Fowler flaps. And Fowler flaps are flaps that are being extended on a rail system. These are some of the flaps that actually extend or increase the surface area of the wing. And as you can see here, the combat flaps breaks off at 620 kilometers an hour. And that's a very good number. And that number can also be found at the very earliest of the P-38s, even in 3.0 and 3.3. And knowing that, it means that whenever you're flying any of the P-38s, you know that you can easily use the combat flaps up to 620 kilometers an hour. Moving on to Germany and the Bf-109G2. Now the German Bf-109G2 and most Second World War fighters use split flaps. And split flaps are not sitting on the trailing edge of the wing, but they're being extended from the underside of the wing. And as you can see here, both combat flaps and takeoff flaps have the same breakoff speed with 460 kilometers an hour. And that basically means if you're in a tight turn where you can see that combat flap is not going to cut it, you can hit that key one more time and then use your takeoff flaps, knowing that they have the same breakoff speed and you can use the takeoff flaps just as effectively as you would combat flaps. Moving on to the Soviet Union. And here we see something completely different again. Also using split flaps, but the Yaks don't have any combat flaps or takeoff flaps at all. You only get access to landing flaps. And the landing flaps rips off at 280 kilometers an hour. So same BR, but a completely different design philosophy. Go to Great Britain. Look at the Typhoon, also 4.3. And here we see a full complement of flaps. Combat flaps, takeoff flaps, and landing flaps. And here again, combat flaps and takeoff flaps have the same rip-off speed. So again, in a tight turn where combat flap doesn't do it, you can click one more time and use the takeoff flaps, and you know that they have the same rip-off speed, so you don't have to reduce speeds further in order to use that flap. If you look at the Speedfire, it also says a 4.3. Again, it's completely different, with no combat flaps, no takeoff flaps, and only landing flaps. And they rip off at a measly 230 kilometers an hour. So, as you can see here, switching from plane to plane, even in the same nation, it's super important that you consult these pages, so you don't by muscle memory just automatically hit that flap button, thinking that of course a Spitfire would have access to combat flaps. And if you hit that flap key, the only thing that happens is you're going to extend the landing run and you're going to rip it off. Moving on to Japan. Something that's fun to think about is that both the Zero and Spitfire are Mason turn fighters, but on the Zero, which also using split flags, again you have a full complement of flaps, and this one is even a slightly better turner or just as good as the Spitfire. Yes, the Spitfire doesn't use flaps at all, and the Zero have access to full flaps. Let's try to look at Italy, also 4.3. And again, there's a difference between lines and models of fighters, of course. Here you have very strong flaps with 600 km an hour rip-off speed for the combat flaps. So in this instance, you can't just hit the combat flaps, and then if it's not enough, hit the flaps key one more time, thinking that your takeoff flaps will be equally strong, because they're not. And if you look at Italy and then go down to a different kind of plane, this is 4.0, completely different numbers. 460 for combat flaps, which are 200 kilometers lower than the other plane, but the takeoff flaps here are much more effective. They might still be split flaps, but they work in a different way. So always remember to look at a plane's information page to figure out all these numbers, especially if you hop from nation to nation and plane to plane. Do yourself a favor and use a couple of seconds consulting these pages. So when will the flaps, any given flaps, be most beneficial to use? Well, there's really only one way to find out, and that's by experimenting with it yourself. So for instance, whenever you go into a dogfight, don't automatically hit the combat flaps as soon as you enter into a dogfight. If you keep your combat flaps deployed all the time, you just keep increasing drag on your plane, and you keep losing speed and energy. Use them wisely combined with the engine control. You can avoid overshooting and stay behind the enemy. And if you're up against several opponents, I would be very careful with using your flaps at all. I much rather keep my speed and energy up in that situation. And if possible, maybe even try to outrun them, depending on what kind of aircraft you're using and what altitude you're fighting at. Like it or not, War Thunder has built in this safety device, if you could call it like that. So whenever you get close to your flap speed limit, you'll get a big fat red warning sign across the screen telling you to be careful. And if you're inexperienced or if you keep switching planes out a lot, it's actually pretty nice to have, so you know when to just hit that key again in order not to lose your flaps. So whenever you use your combat flaps or landing flaps or takeoff flaps in a dogfight situation, there's always this sweet spot. So for instance, you of course get a tighter turn radius by using combat flaps. But if you use too much flaps, you might turn tighter, but your turn time, or your turn circle rather, will increase and not decrease. So if you want to make a 360 degrees turn, it's not always beneficial to apply as much flap as possible. Sometimes it's better just to leave it off, and sometimes you can do a 360 faster without using any flaps at all. It's just something worth thinking about. If you like and appreciate the content I'm providing, please do me a big favor and subscribe, give it a like, or leave a comment. Thank you for watching, and until next time, have a good one.